Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Merry Christmas Eve from Jim Geraghty of National Review and me, Greg Corombos of Radio America. Hopefully you were with us on Friday when we began our special six-part year-end Crystal Martini Awards for 2018. 3 categories in each episode for the final 6 editions of our podcast for the year. Friday, we took a look at the most underrated, overrated, and honest politicians for 2018. Today, we'll be taking a look at, first of all, the political figure we're sorry to see go in 2018, then the rising political star of the year, and the political figure fading into oblivion. And, Jim, we unfortunately have to start with the somber, as we always do in the second installment, and that's the political figure we're sorry to see go. Sometimes we're scrambling because there just aren't a lot of political passings in a year. 2018 had a ton of them.
And there were just so many to choose from. You can say sorry to see go in terms of passing on, and John McCain and George H.W. Bush in that category. Talk about in terms of political defeat and probably leaving politics. I mentioned Mia Love the other day, House Speaker Paul Ryan. But I'm going to go with a different choice, somebody who's kind of shown up a lot in these awards over the years, outgoing Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. And I think you want to talk about the story of Republicans, the Tea Party, and the rise and the entire response to the Obama administration. First of all, let's dispel this idea that Scott Walker was boring. He was not as boring as he seemed. I think the fact that the way people react to Scott Walker, beginning with his, presidential campaign in 2016 that lasted for about 10 minutes. Look, this is a man whose record and accomplishments and thinking, his style was steak. It was not sizzle. Sweeping reforms to the use of public sector unions in his state, tax cuts, all kinds of anti-regulatory movements. I mean, this was kind of your prototypical conservative governance in a state that was purple, and some had argued it was starting to turn red as recently as 2016. It was serious. It was accomplishment. This is, the kind of leader I like to see. I think the more time I spend covering politics, Greg, the more I get tired of the folks who are there's nothing wrong with being entertaining, nothing wrong with being funny. But after a while, you can tell whether they've actually read their white papers and actually have done their homework, or whether they're basically playing an act and are just, pundits who kind of stumbled into actual political power. I just want to point out, when Scott Walker was elected governor in 2010, the unemployment rate in Wisconsin was 8.2%. It had actually been up past 9% earlier that year. On Election Day 2018, unemployment in Wisconsin was 2.9%. Full employment is generally seen as around 4%, and it had actually been well below that for quite some time. Wisconsin, I hope you know what you're doing. I think it's very unlikely that unemployment will be as low as 2.9% 4 years from now. We'll see how things shake out. But you had it really good. You had a really, really good, thriving economy, and you got rid of the guy who was the architect of all that. So I hope you're happy, Wisconsin. We'll see how this works out for you. My suspicion is it will not. And I hope that Scott Walker ends up returning to politics in one form or another. But again, just very frustrating to see a guy who was your prototypical conservative governor enacting serious, sweeping reforms and just not getting any love for it from the voters.
Yeah, absolutely. I was hoping. I stayed up much later than I should have that night because he was starting to close the gap, and then ultimately they found some more votes in Milwaukee, and that was the end of the line. But you're right. Scott Walker is just about as, if you could create a conservative governor to do the job for 8 years, that's about as close as we could possibly get. He had courage. He had intelligence. He fortunately had a legislature that was cooperative for the most part. And as you said, with the unemployment rate and so many other things in Wisconsin, the results speak for themselves. You could almost make the case that because the Democratic Party is so fired up in opposition to Trump in the midterm elections, that Trump actually beat Scott Walker twice, once in the 2016 primaries and once in 2018. But the Democrats, let's be honest, the Democrats have had it out for Scott Walker for a long time. He fended them off 3 times, and the 4th time he just couldn't. But sometimes people get tired of you, even if you've done a fantastic job in a 3rd term in a purple state. It was perhaps a little bit too much, particularly given the political wins this year. But I think a lot of folks are going to miss Scott Walker in a very short period of time. I'm going to go to the more traditional role of this category, and that's to talk about somebody who did pass away. And there were so many options this year. There's George Bush. There was Barbara Bush. There was the Reverend Billy Graham, who was a great friend of the Bushes and many presidents, although his greatest impact, I would say, is definitely not in politics. And as you mentioned, John McCain. And they have obviously gotten a ton of attention, and rightly so. And On the conservative media side, you had Charles Krauthammer, who had such a powerful impact on conservative thought and the way arguments were forged over the past 30 years. Just a phenomenal job. But I'm actually going to pick a Democrat, and mainly I'm doing this because he didn't get enough attention when he passed away, and that is former Georgia Governor and Senator Zell Miller. Zell Miller was a Democrat, refused to flip to the Republican Party. He became senator when a Republican named Paul Coverdell died in the late 1990s, and the Democratic governor of Georgia at the time appointed Miller to fill that term, and then he won another full term, I believe, shortly thereafter. He retired in 2004. And shortly before the 2004 election, I think it was Sean Hannity who asked him, well, who are you going to vote for in 2004? Because obviously Howard Dean was leading the primary at that point, and you had a lot of other liberals on board. And Zell Miller was a big defense hawk, and he had actually co-sponsored the first round of the Bush tax cuts. And he says, I'm voting for George Bush. And as a result of that, it ultimately turned out that he became the keynote speaker at the 2004 Republican convention in New York. And he went on this long tirade about how John Kerry wants to be commander-in-chief, but has opposed the development of every major weapons system that we've had over the past number of decades, from the B-1 bomber to the B-2 bomber to the Apache attack helicopters to F-14A Tomcats and on and on and on. And here's how he finished that little part of the speech up in New York City.
Against the Patriot missile that shot down Saddam Hussein's Scud missiles over Israel, against the Aegis air defense cruiser, against the Strategic Defense Initiative, against the Trident missile, against. This is the man who wants to be the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. U.S. forces armed with what? Spitballs?
Jim, I remember being on the floor of that convention and just laughing out loud at that line. More people are going to remember him for going on Chris Matthews afterwards and getting into such a dust-up that he challenged Matthews to a duel, or at least talking about a duel. But that line and his willingness to stick his neck out and stand for what he believed when his party was changing radically right before his eyes. Zell Miller, passing away this year at the age of 86, will be greatly missed.
The moment I realized where you were going with this, the word spitballs came in my head, and he probably will be forever remembered by that. I don't know about you, Greg. I would have loved to have seen a duel between he and it's not quite up there with Burr and Hamilton, but, give these guys, you know what you do? You give them a duel with spitballs so nobody gets hurt. How's that sound?
Let's move on now, Jim, to rising political star. Who do you have?
We elected a lot of young Democrats this year. And so any one of them could end up being a rising star. I think it's very clear that we're going to be talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for a very long time. But I think probably the figure who appeared on the scene and who seemed to have the single healthiest effect on our discourse and our debate is newly elected Texas Congressman Dan Crenshaw. And obviously, he's right on all the issues, this extremely impressive veteran. But I just think the way he handled his interaction with Pete Davidson on Saturday Night Live, that this very easily could have been your standard issue. Can you believe this snotty liberal comedian on Saturday Night Live made this joke about a war veteran? And we were all primed for that. And then Dan Crenshaw, shortly after the election, does his cameo appearance on Weekend Update. And there's a little bit of the usual jokes, but he just took this, not just taking the high road, I think setting an example for everybody. And Greg, I believe you have some of the audio from that?
Sure do. Here it is.
Okay, but seriously, there's a lot of lessons to learn here. Not just that the left and right can still agree on some things, but also this: Americans can forgive one another. We can remember what brings us together as a country and still see the good in each other. This is Veterans Day weekend, which means that it's a good time for every American to connect with a veteran. Maybe say thanks for your service, but I would actually encourage you to say something else. Tell a veteran, never forget. When you say never forget to a veteran, you are implying that, as an American, you are in it with them, not separated by some imaginary barrier between civilians and veterans, but connected together as grateful fellow Americans who will never forget the sacrifices made by veterans past and present, and never forget those we lost on 9/11, heroes like Pete's father. So I'll just say, Pete, never forget.
Never forget. And that is from both of us.
Maybe the most beautiful political moment of the year. and maybe many years. Because somebody made the argument about, you see these social media outrage mobs form, and somebody argued, we're a less religious, a less Christian country than we used to be. But the great irony is we still very much have this concept of sin, and we still very much have this concept of punishing people for sins. But this new kind of modern philosophy doesn't have room for forgiveness, doesn't have room for redemption. The joke from Pete Davidson was obnoxious and stupid and all that stuff. But, I don't know if that needs to define Pete Davidson for the rest of his life. And in fact, it really shouldn't. Maybe his breakup with Ariana Grande is a better reason to better thing to mark him for the rest of his life. I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, and Dan Crenshaw put in a few jokes about that during his appearance. But in the end, you don't have to hate Pete Davidson. And if you're on the left, you don't have to hate Dan Crenshaw. I don't think you should. You really shouldn't be full of this endless rage towards your political opponents, because whatever their flaws, no matter how wrong their thinking is, no matter how idiotic their ideas are, no matter how destructive their agenda would be, in the end, they're Americans, and they're trying to build a better country from the way they see it themselves. And we do have bigger, larger things that unite us. So it was just I think a beautiful moment, and I think one that very few members of Congress, or really very few people in politics, could have pulled off so authentically and heartfeltly, and just put it so darn well. So I hope to see a lot more from Dan Crenshaw. He's got some interesting social media moments. He seems like a guy who's still full of wonder. He walks around Capitol Hill. He's been doing his orientation meetings, and he talks about how it feels to be joining this chamber and the history and all of the key American figures who've walked through the same halls and stuff. So he just seems like a terrific guy, and I hope to see a lot more of him in the future.
That really was probably the best political moment of the year, just because for the exact reason you said. We all expected a certain type of response, because that's what we always get nowadays, is just condemning and demonizing people. And he didn't. He chose the high road. He chose forgiveness. And that is exactly how God would want us to act. He's very clear about that. And the fact that it was demonstrated so beautifully, even on Saturday Night Live, is a great testament to Crenshaw, and hopefully it's an example that other people are willing to follow. But in the Twitter / instant reaction cable news world that we're in right now, it takes more courage to do that than to do the other. So hopefully more folks will follow his lead. Your choice is better than mine, but I'm still pretty happy with mine. I'm going with Josh Hawley. I think he's perhaps poised to be, of the new Republican senators, the one that we're going to be most happy with. I think we're going to be happy with all of them. We talked about Rick Scott on Friday, and Mike Braun as well, and I think Kevin Cramer's going to do a good job. And then we've got some who won open seats like Mitt Romney, who we already know quite a bit about. Josh Hawley is a guy who is pretty young, and he's also gotten a lot done in that time. I don't even think he's 40 years old yet. And he, as Attorney General of Missouri, led some religious freedom cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court and won. I think it had to do with using government funds for playgrounds on church school grounds and things like that. And then he also had a very difficult job in the middle of his effort to be elected U.S. Senator, and that was investigate the sitting governor of his own party for alleged campaign violations. Eric Greitens got into a whole lot of trouble about an affair he had and everything he did to try and cover that up, which we won't get into. But then Josh Hawley discovered that Greitens had misused donor lists, with Hawley being very concerned that he was using donor lists from other conservative organizations as a fundraising list. He was willing to crack down on the political leader of his own party in his own state, which is usually not the prescription for political success, especially if that person ends up surviving politically. Greitens didn't, but nonetheless, it was a politically courageous move. I think if you look at Josh Hawley's political positions, he's going to be a rock-solid conservative for the next 6 years and hopefully more to come.
Yeah, I was going to say we have some new Republican senators in there. Talked about Rick Scott earlier in our award series. Look, it was not a great year for the Republican Party as a whole, particularly in the House, but there are some rising stars. There are some seeds that are being planted to give the party some interesting options down the road. So hopefully a lot of, good flourishing careers are getting started here.
All right. The flip side of rising is fading, and fading into oblivion is our final category for this particular episode. Jim, who is the political figure now fading into oblivion at the end of 2018? I know quite a few who I'd like to see in that role, but I think the list is shorter than a lot of people figure. But who do you pick?
A figure who I have very mixed feelings about. It is former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick. who announced he's not running for president. He managed to do this when I was like halfway through writing a profile on him, assuming that he would. So first of all, damn you, Deval Patrick. If anyone's interested in buying half of a profile of Deval Patrick, contact me offline. But here's the interesting. So when you're a guy who's been a governor a while ago, you choose not to run in 2020. When there will be so many Democrats running for president, you're going to need the Census Bureau to keep track of all of them. It says really you're not ever going to run for president. If he's not running now, he's not going to be running in 2024 or 2028 or anything like that. And so I think it's kind of by the standards of Democrats. People would say, who do you think they should run? Who worries you and stuff like that? Generally, my answer would usually be Deval Patrick, and in part because he's lefty, but he's not the crazy hard left of the party. I think he's the one guy in the party who can indisputably say that he was in leadership during a time of crisis, as Massachusetts governor during the Boston Marathon bombing. Now, people can argue about whether he handled that well. He was no doubt part of the decision that basically shut down the city of Boston on that Friday of the infamous week. People can argue about whether that was oppressive for civil liberties or whether it was a necessary step that ended up catching that second bomber. The other thing that's really kind of interesting is there was somebody who did get his profile written on time was over in the New Yorker, and he said some interesting observations. First of all, the observation that he's not a populist, and he didn't wear it well. Even though he grew up poor and on welfare, got a scholarship to a private high school outside Boston, got into Harvard, went to Harvard Law. And then the interesting thing is he went into corporate America for a lot of years. General counsel for Texaco, general counsel for the Coca-Cola company, eventually the company that was the head of AmeriQuest, which you may remember for predatory lending, But, people are like, what's he been doing lately? After he stopped being governor, Greg, he became managing director of Bain Capital. Yes, that's right. The very same place that was founded by Mitt Romney. So my suspicion, Greg, is that because it appears Deval Patrick follows Mitt Romney wherever he goes. He followed Mitt Romney as governor of Massachusetts. He followed Mitt Romney as managing governor of Bain Capital. My suspicion is that maybe he won't fade into oblivion. Perhaps Deval Patrick will someday be senator from Utah. But short of that, he's kind of a voice of a Democrat who did not see corporate America as the enemy. And did not, I wouldn't have minded having somebody on that stage, just kind of, throw some water on the rising tide of socialism in that party. In that interview with the New Yorker, he said, look, Democrats sometimes make it a lot more about what's wrong with them than what's right with us. And look, it's going to be a cold day in Hades before I end up voting for a Democrat anytime soon. But my suspicion is that the Democrats in the country would be better served by that kind of positive agenda instead of denouncing Republicans as a basket of deplorables and stuff like that. So I don't think Deval Patrick will be in the realm of politics for much longer. I think he's going to quickly fade from this. And I think it's kind of unfortunate because I think he could have been a somewhat moderating figure in a party that seemed to be racing further leftward every day.
Wow. Interesting choice. Yeah, he's you're right. If he's not going to run this time, he's probably going to stay in the private sector. And, like I said in introducing this category, there's a ton of people I'd love to award this to if I thought it was really true, like Jeff Flake and John Kasich, who I think are going to go out there and form the Golly Gee Whiz caucus about how disappointed they are in President Trump on a daily basis and be meddlesome in some form or fashion in 2020. I almost gave it to last year's rising star, Scott Pruitt. How was that for not quite accurate? But I'm going to give it to Paul Ryan. I think he's genuinely done with politics. I don't see him running again in 2024 or any other time. I think he feels like he put in his time in public service. I think he's going to go make a mint somewhere in the private sector, whether it's in Washington or Wisconsin or somewhere else. I think he's perfectly content to watch his kids finish their teenage years and then become young adults. And you can say good things and bad things about Paul Ryan. I think he set good goals for the Republican Party. I think in a perfect world he would have liked balanced budgets and curtailed spending. But in the end, as Speaker, even though he had the majority, he couldn't get it done. He couldn't get it done towards the end of the Obama years, couldn't get it done when the Republicans had control of everything here in the first 2 years of the Trump administration. So a guy of good intentions, I think, for the most part, but a guy who, when the chips were down, couldn't get a lot of it done, which is unfortunate. But Paul Ryan, in the end, I think we're not going to hear a whole lot from him publicly in the years ahead.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You think back to the Tea Party and its push for reducing spending, getting control of the debt and the deficit. And I think even you could say there's a certain to the extent we've had any appetite for entitlement reform, the Tea Party certainly seemed to be pushing for that, or at least open to that during some of its rallies and comments to that. There were some folks who keep your hands off my Medicare and things like that. But, Paul Ryan was, probably more than anybody else, really tried to get the country to deal with that issue. And I think it's now very clear that for the past generation, going back not just to Ryan, but George W. Bush and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, his effort at Social Security reform after the 2004 election, the country doesn't want to deal with it. And there were like 15 of the 17 Republicans and who were running in 2016 had, thought about trying to deal with that issue. The two who did not were Trump and Huckabee, and, Trump's president. The country doesn't want to deal with this problem. And I think that always, obviously for trying to get the country to deal with this problem, we all had commercials of him, pushing grandma off a cliff. So I think you're right. It would not surprise me in the slightest to see Paul Ryan now in his mid-40s walk away from politics and be perfectly happy walking away from politics. He's been at the heights. There's certainly a lot of folks who really believed he was going to be vice president of the United States in 2012. Did not shake out that way. Ended up becoming speaker. Didn't want to stay as speaker. Nobody, there was no real serious options to replace him. We'll see how McCarthy does as a minority leader. Yeah, there were a lot of conservatives very just, cranky with him. I think it's also worth noting that there are a lot of jobs that are compared to herding cats. And I think getting all the House Republican caucus swimming in the same direction or pulling their oars in the same direction has always been a tough challenge. So I'm sorry to see him go as well. I kind of think he's going to be successful, whatever else he does in life, but you'd completely understand if he said, you know what, I've been in politics a long time, I'm done with it, I did everything I wanted to do. Good luck, America, you're on your own.
And because I love statistics, Jim, I'm going to throw this out there. Paul Ryan is retiring at the age of 48 years old, which means a couple of things. First of all, he's leaving as Speaker of the House at a younger age by many, many years than Nancy Pelosi when she became the Democratic leader. I believe she was 62 when she became the Democratic leader. So he's leaving 14 years younger. In fact, he's leaving only 1 year older than Nancy Pelosi when she was first elected to Congress. So he's got a lot of years ahead of him.
Yeah, there we go. It'd be interesting to see what he does and all that kind of stuff. Every once in a while, you'll hear John Boehner will pop up in an interview, and I most of what I hear, I understand the last couple comments when you call. So, what do you think of how the House is being run these days? All you just hear is hysterical laughter on the line from John Boehner. So, my sense is a lot of these retired congressional leaders really, really enjoy retirement, because all these people who are bashing them suddenly get to replace them and all of a sudden say, oh, my goodness, it's a lot harder than it looks from the outside.
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons why John Boehner may say that. Number one is because he's glad he's not there anymore. Number two is he's big into lobbying for legalized weed now. So there could be a couple extra reasons for why.
Yeah, he is a little more relaxed. There you go. See, it's also co-sponsored by the National Munchies Lobby.
John Boehner. Anyway, all right, Jim, have a great day. Have a very Merry Christmas, and we'll see you on Wednesday.
See you Wednesday, Greg. Merry Christmas to you, too.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. A wonderful Merry Christmas to all of our 3 Martini Lunch listeners. Enjoy the days with your family, and join us again on Wednesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.